Szanowni Państwo, dziś mam przyjemność polecić kolejną książkę naszego patrona, wydawnictwa Deregio, pod tytułem Prawdziwy Izrael, fałszywy judaizm, autorstwa księdza Jeana-Michel Gleize. Jest to, można by powiedzieć, teologiczny i filozoficzny tour de force o tym, czym jest judaizm, o jego esencji, metodą scholastyczną, prowadzenie ku prawdzie bez żadnej politycznej poprawności i zbędnych, że tak powiem, ekumenizmów. Tę książkę i inne znajdziecie w linku wydawnictwa Deregio, który to link jest dzisiaj załączony w naszym programie. Polecam bardzo serdecznie. Dr Michał Krupa.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to DR Global, the English language podcast of Do Rzeczy, Poland's largest conservative weekly. Today is Thursday, November 20th, 2025, and I am your host, Mike Krupa. Here we speak with leading English-speaking thinkers and analysts and commentators about global events from a realist and common sense perspective. Conversations we believe are essential for a Polish audience seeking clarity in a rapidly changing world. Today's episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Deregio Publishing House. You'll find the link in the description box. If you'd like to support our work directly or buy us a coffee, the link is also available in the description box. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Really helps our channel grow. And since we are in the theme of Deregio Publishing House, today I'd like to present our Polish audience with Deregio's latest book called Diabelska Gwardia, which is a journey to French Indochina, deep into the jungle where the inhuman laws of revolutionary Viet Minh reign. It is the kind of place where only men with little left to lose can be sent. Former SS officers receive an offer from the Foreign Legion, the gallows for war crimes automatically assigned to them, or fighting in the tropics against an old enemy, the communists. The choice doesn't seem difficult, at least not during the training organized in the desert by the loosely assembled French units. However, the conditions in the jungle, filled with guerrilla fighters, turn out to be, to put it mildly, far more demanding. A great read for a cold winter evening, Diabelska Gwardia, available now at Deregio Publishing House, our sponsor. The link is in the description. Guys, let's get started. We have another very special guest today, the one, the only, Colonel Douglas McGregor. Now, allow me during the interview, this is by no means a sign of lack of culture. Me and the Colonel have known each other for some time now, so I will be calling Colonel McGregor by his first name. He has given me the imprimatur for that some time ago. But just to give you a background on our guest today, Douglas McGregor, PhD, is a decorated U.S. Army veteran who led troops in the Battle of 73 Easting during the First Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, one of the largest tank battles in U.S. history. Over his 28-year career, he taught at the Department of Social Sciences at West Point, commanded a cavalry squadron, and shaped operational planning at NATO headquarters. After retiring, Colonel McGregor became a prominent military strategist and geopolitical analyst, writing influential books such as Breaking the Phalanx and Transformation Under Fire. In 2020, he was appointed senior advisor to the then Secretary of Defense under President Donald Trump, a role he held until early 2021. He is widely recognized for his realist critique of military doctrine and his advocacy of strategic reform, and also for, I would add, his political incorrectness. Doug, how are you doing this evening, my friend?
Trying to defend my political incorrectness.
As usual. Good. Then we should have a very lively discussion. Doug, I want to jump right into it. In the last couple of days, we've been hearing a lot of chatter coming out from the Western media mostly. The Kremlin seems to be mute at this point on this topic. However, it does seem there is a new push for a so-called peace plan, which seems to be a bit more refined than with what President Trump came in during the summit in Anchorage, which seemed like a plan on the fly, basically. But from what I'm seeing, when you look at the panic of most of the European elites reacting to this plan, this time there might be something interesting in this peace plan that the Kremlin might find enticing and interesting to take into consideration. What's your view on these developments?
At the moment, based upon what I'm hearing and what I've been able to read, I don't think the Kremlin is going to support this. there are some strident statements in the agreement that suggest that the Russians have to give up Kharkov, Sumy, all these areas to the north where they have been fighting. And I don't see much evidence that the Russians will go along with that. There's also a discussion about freezing current lines again. Once again, I'm not sure the Russians are willing to do that either. Now, having said that, if you turn to the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians have essentially vomited all over this. And I think the Europeans are doing the same thing with them. I don't know how Mr. Witkoff came up with this. I don't know who it was with whom he discussed these matters. I'm sure it is a sincere attempt on the part of Donald Trump to try and snatch defeat from the jaws, or victory from the jaws of defeat. But I don't see it happening. I think this is going to rapidly vanish from the scene, and the Russians are going to have to come to terms with reality that they're going to have to finish this. And I think the Russians would rather not. They would rather come to some sort of an arrangement. And this is certainly better than what's been on offer in the past, but it's not nearly enough for the Russians. The Russians simply don't want to have to refight this war in the future. They're very serious about eliminating this regime and its adherents, what they call denazification, which is effectively demilitarization. These things are not really open for debate or discussion. So right now, I don't see much coming from this draft agreement.
What do you make of the assertions that have been made online and in some media that the Nabu case against Zelenskyy and his cronies regarding the latest Mindich Gate, as they call it, was orchestrated by Washington? Because we do know, and President Putin made this statement actually on the day that he announced the invasion of Ukraine, where he said that Nabu was under the direct control of the West. And he might have even said direct control of Washington. Do you think this entire case is hatched in Washington to do a regime change against Zelenskyy? What's your feel on the situation?
Well, given the fact that these people that they've identified that have now fled to Israel, where they can't be extradited, because if a Jew goes to Israel, the Israeli state is by law obligated to open its gates and admit them, and not to extradite them under any circumstances. But these people are minor players. Talking about hundreds of millions of dollars may seem like a huge sum to people like us, but in reality, billions have been pilfered and stolen outrightly. So frankly, this is a small sacrifice on a very large altar that deserves a lot more attention and more victims. So I think on the one hand, it's kind of a gesture on the part of Washington to finally try to address, these accusations or allegations of widespread fraud. But one can't take it very seriously because these people simply aren't big players. Keep in mind that Zelenskyy has over $1 billion in cash sitting in various bank accounts, owns numerous estates in Florida, Italy, and I imagine he's probably got something in Israel. When you put all of those things together, this really doesn't amount to a hill of beans. Now, the good news for the Russians, and I think ultimately for us, is that this Ukrainian regime is in ruins. It's not going to last much longer. It's really, truly on the ropes, or on the last legs, as we like to say. But I don't think that this is some great revelation that heralds an immediate regime change. If that regime change comes, which it ought to, it's probably going to have to be done internally. Although the Russians may finally decide they have no choice but to execute it as well. They've always known where Zelenskyy and his inner circle are located. They have chosen not to attack them, largely because I think the Russians want someone to talk to end this thing. But it may have reached a point now where they realize talking to these people is hopeless.
Doug, yesterday on the program, we had Colonel Jacques Beau. You probably know of the colonel and his works.
Sure.
And I asked him a very specific question because most of our audience internationally and here in Poland is not, for the most part, I'm guessing, military savvy in the way that you and Colonel Beau are. But I asked him to basically sort of counter the argument that the Russians, they should have won this war a long time ago, that they're basically a crappy army, that they're not making any significant advancements. And the only reason why they're winning in the general sense is because they have more people and they have more equipment, but there's no real tactical culture behind what they're doing in Ukraine right now. Now, Colonel Bow gave a very comprehensive, I would even say, academic answer, striking that assertion down. I would like to get your opinion as a combat veteran, as somebody who actually saw action, about what the true nature of Russian tactics and Russian strategy is in Ukraine from a military standpoint.
Well, let's start at the top, because I think one of the organizing imperatives for the entire campaign has always been President Putin's determination to avoid at all costs a direct military confrontation with the United States and NATO. Now, some people may think that, well, this is very odd. Well, why would this be the case? He genuinely wants new conditions to emerge at the end of this conflict. Now, many of his Russian colleagues think he's delusional, to be blunt. That's not to say they don't support him, but they just don't see any future with the West. I think President Putin does. I think he believes strongly in the notion that if they can put this war behind them and they can get the kinds of conditions for neutrality in whatever remains of Ukraine, that ultimately they can make peace with the West, especially, to be perfectly blunt, with Germany, and resume good economic relations. I think he's probably right, although it seems unlikely at this point. But I think he's also begun to watch very carefully what's happening in the Western capitals. And it's pretty obvious to anybody who has any common sense at all and understanding of the world that Mr. Starmer in London, Macron in Paris, and ultimately Merz in Berlin are all on the road to extinction. These are globalist regimes that have done enormous damage to their own people. On the one hand, they've insisted that Russia is this dangerous, aggressive force, which it isn't, that Russia is hell-bent to overrun all of Europe, which it isn't. And instead, they have argued repeatedly that, we, that is, the Europeans, have to arm ourselves to the teeth. So suddenly they've broken all the constitutional constraints. They're spending, much as we are, recklessly and pointlessly on all sorts of military gear and equipment, which will take years to produce. And just because you spend money on defense doesn't mean you produce a capable military organization. That's one level. And I think what President Putin is doing is he's saying very soon could be in 3 months, 6 months, whatever, we're going to see these governments in Western Europe vanish. When they vanish, when they are thrown out of power, new governments are going to emerge that are indisputably nationalist. These nationalist governments will be concerned, rightly, by the way, with the welfare, prosperity, and survival of their own countries. And so there will be a shift in terms of the focus from this boogeyman that is being created in Russia to what's happening inside these countries. Now, the Poles have been very smart. They did not open their gates to millions of people from the Middle East and Africa and North Africa to march into their countries and become wards of the state and to drive up criminality. But that has happened in Britain and France and Germany, and the people that live in those countries are sick of it. They're going to turn their attention to that enemy, which is far more dangerous and is actually existential. And this whole focus on Russia is going to go away. So I think those two things are at work with President Putin. Why should you rush forward any further west than absolutely necessary when you see these kinds of forces at work? Secondly, when this war began, and this is very interesting to me, and I'm sure Jacques Beau may have mentioned this at some point, everyone in the West was saying, oh, see, the Russians are weak. Their army is too small. They are incapable. And the Ukrainians are beating the hell out of them. Well, the second part was never true. The Ukrainians were never beating the hell out of the Russians. But the Russians had an army that was too small. It was not adequate for the task that it was assigned. When it became clear in April of 2022 that there would be no peace because Washington and London were absolutely determined to ensure the war continue, that's when there had to be a meeting between President Putin and the general staff, and they had to make some decisions. And the key decision was our force is too small. We need a larger, more robust, and more capable force. And so they went on to the strategic defense. And the strategic defense gave them an enormous advantage because for some time, the Russians, at least intellectually and professionally, had understood what could be achieved at the operational and strategic levels if you could link intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, essentially from seabed all the way to space, particularly space-based, to strike systems being everything from mortars to tube artillery to rockets to cruise missiles, theater ballistic missiles, glide bombs, you name it. And they built a system that allowed them within the space of a couple of minutes to bring to bear enormously destructive standoff attack weapons against the Ukrainians. At the same time, they built fortifications along this line, which I've referred to as the Surovikin line because General Surovikin was the man behind the idea. And then the Ukrainians, thanks to the brilliant advice they were receiving from the NATO military leaders, ultimately impaled themselves on this defense repeatedly, over and over and over again. You know, if you went back and pulled all the statements by all the great luminaries like David Petraeus or Ben Hodges or Jack Keane or any number of these people, they all say the same thing. Now that they have all these tanks, now they have all these guns, and now that they've had all this training, they're going to be successful. They're going to smash through these defenses. They're going to defeat the Russians. Well, we all know what happened. They were obliterated because at the same time, you had another revolution in progress, and that of these unmanned aerial vehicles. We call them drones now, all different sizes, types, and kinds. And these changed the nature of the battlefield, making it almost impossible for the Ukrainians to mass and for the Ukrainians to move and do anything. In many ways, the battlefield changed into something very similar to what the Germans faced in the West in the last year of the Second World War, where any German unit that tried to move in daylight, any German unit that was assembled in great density and could be found in the daylight would be destroyed by Allied air and artillery power. That meant that the German army was largely paralyzed and could only move at night. Well, this is even worse because you don't need daylight to find anybody anymore. You can find people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and inflict enormous damage on them. And it's during this period that begins in the fall of 2022 and goes through 2023 into 2024, where hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian lives are lost and squandered on these pointless offensives that had no chance of success whatsoever, thanks to this tightly integrated, what I call ISR strike complex, which includes everything from the tactical level all the way up to the strategic in terms of unmanned and manned systems. Now, I don't know what Jacques has had to say, but the outcome of all of this is a Ukrainian military machine that is being bled out, that has no more humanity to sacrifice, and has been in that position now for roughly a year. And right now, if you look at the battlefield, what you see, the Russians have developed this pattern of inching forward, putting essentially flanks of the Ukrainians at risk, eventually cutting them off, encircling them, and then pounding them out of existence. And people say, well, why don't the Russians move faster? Because Vladimir Putin is probably the first in Russian history, first leader of Russia to express serious concern for Russian lives. He's unwilling to sacrifice them. And his view is, why should we sacrifice Russian lives needlessly on the tactical battlefield when we can obliterate the Ukrainians who are now immobilized, paralyzed, and encircled? And so this has worked very, very well. Today, there's practically nothing between the Dnieper River and massive Russian forces. But there's another feature that has to be kept in mind. When the Russians went in, they wanted to liberate the Russian population from the oppressive treatment meted out to them by the Ukrainians. They've done that. They've now annexed these things, but they're not interested in governing, administering, or ruling Ukrainians. they're very happy to have the Russian population that lives in eastern Ukraine that's happy to be back in the fold with Russia, but they're not interested in dragging Ukrainians into it. If there's one thing that comes up for discussion in Moscow, based on my sources frequently, it's the notion that, well, these people in Western Ukraine hate us. They're never going to not hate us. They don't want us. We don't want them. We would just like them not to present a threat to us. And on more than one occasion, somebody raises the issue was, well, why don't we talk to Warsaw? These areas were under Polish administration for years. And then everybody bursts out laughing because the Russians say, well, we know how well the Poles got along with these Western Ukrainians. The bottom line is that this war is, for all intents and purposes, over. The longer it continues, the more people will die pointlessly. And the numbers of Russians that are being killed are almost minuscule compared with what they were 2 years ago or 3 years ago, because the entire Ukrainian force is in retreat. It's falling apart. It's surrendering. It's essentially in the same condition as the Germans were in March and April of 1945. So, I don't know what Jacques said, but my point is this. The Russians figured out how to fight this war, how to fight it while minimizing their losses and inflicting maximum losses on the Ukrainians, number one. Number two, they very, very rapidly stood up and mobilized their defense industry. And they went to a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week production system. And they learned how to modify existing pieces of equipment and how to use existing pieces of equipment differently from the way we have in the past. One of the things I laugh at all the time is people say, well, see, tanks are now obsolete. I mean, we've made these comments now, I think since 1918. They're obsolete, and only to discover that, no, they're not obsolete, but it makes a big difference how you utilize and employ your armor. Well, the Russians have rediscovered the value of the assault gun. And most of the tanks that are being employed not as traditional maneuver entities, but as assault guns to come in, blast, and finish off the enemy on the ground after it has already been subjected to massive attacks from above. So at this stage, I think it's a terrible mistake to dismiss the Russians as not thoughtful, not innovative, not imaginative, weak, incompetent. And I think one of your own, I think it was a former chief of staff of the Polish army, or maybe it's the current one, made the statement that this was not true 2 years ago. He said the Russians are tough. They're competent. They're well led. They're well disciplined. They're well trained. And we should not dismiss them. He was right. He's still right. And with each passing day, the Russians get better.
Indeed. Well, I would have to say that great minds think alike, because definitely squares with what Colonel Bout said yesterday. Doug, just staying on the topic of Russia and Ukraine, you've probably heard of the latest attempted so-called sabotage in Poland, whereby a railway line leading towards Ukraine and apparently used for transporting military equipment was blown up by Russian operatives. Well, it turns out that the two men implicated in this were both Ukrainian citizens, and one of them actually, and this was confirmed by our prime minister, was actually sentenced in Ukraine for sabotage on behalf of the Russians. And then magically he turns up in Poland to do sabotage for the Russians again, which kind of raises a lot of eyebrows. But as you can imagine, in response to this incident, the Polish political class, our mainstream media, most of the political parties in the parliament, with the exception of two, and our highest military commander, the chief of the general staff of the Polish armed forces, General Wiesław Kukuła, actually said that this so-called Russian sabotage attempt is a signal that Russia, in his words, is preparing to attack, is preparing for war. I was wondering if you have any comments on such, out there statements, to say the least.
Maybe it's time that somebody in the Polish general staff went to the library and dusted off a couple of books about Nestor Makhno, who was the Ukrainian anarchist that couldn't make up his mind whom he wanted to kill. Were they Bolsheviks? Were they Ukrainian nationalists? Were they Poles? Whatever. I think Ukraine is once again a very confusing place. It's out of control. It's not under any effective government, in my judgment. I think the place is just falling apart. The notion that the Russians want to move want to move west is just nonsense. I get the impression, though, that the globalist governments and the military leaders that they have appointed, are desperate to provoke the Russians into attacking them, thinking that if they can provoke the Russians into doing something that they can construe or present as unambiguously offensive and dangerous to them, that they will awaken some enthusiasm for war with Russia in their populations. Now, I'm not in Poland, you are, and you can judge this. But I can tell you from my contacts in places like Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Germany, there is no enthusiasm for a war with Russia. The same thing is true in France and increasingly in England and Scotland and Wales. The people there are far more concerned about the dangers at home that confront them than they are about anything the Russians want to do. And none of these armies are large enough to make a dent. I mean, one thing we have to say is that the Polish army is a very good force. Now, is it large enough for the task? No. But the Polish army is in far, far better condition right now than the German, French, or British armies. And the soldiers are better disciplined and better trained, and the officers, I think, are better. This is just my personal observation and the reports that I get from Americans who see all of these armies. But the bottom line is there's no enthusiasm for going to war. Now, you tell me, what is the mood in Poland? Is everyone anxious to sign up and march east and fight the Russians along the Dnieper River, or what's happening? You tell me, but I don't see any enthusiasm in Western Europe at all.
No, by no means. As a matter of fact, it's been noted by the government and the mainstream media, as a matter of fact, that they're sort of getting irritated that every time there's this Ukrainian most likely sponsored provocation, which began with, the missile in Przewodów, which killed 2 Polish citizens. Then we had the so-called the drone shenanigans back in September, which there are still a lot of question marks around that, to say the least. Now we have the supposed railway sabotage. Every single time you're getting guys with Ukrainian passports that are doing this. Now the media is telling us that they were working for the Russian government, which technically is true. I mean, which technically is possible. But I mean, every single one of them was working for the Russian government. I mean, despite the obvious evidence, there's never the question asked, could it have been the Ukrainians? Especially if you consider that, our former Polish president, Andrzej Duda, said that he was conscious of the fact that Zelenskyy was trying to bring Poland into the fight. I mean, he admitted that, too bad when he left the presidency, but he did say that. Those are his words. So there is no enthusiasm for going to war with Russia, obviously, in Poland. And I would agree with you that this does look like a desperate attempt to bring us in. But switching gears, Doug, going back to, I guess, a little more internal U.S. politics, the whole Epstein affair seems to have blown up, despite the fact that President Trump did encourage congressmen to vote for releasing the files, although after chastising such American luminaries of MAGA as Representative Thomas Massie and Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who were basically the salt of the earth when it comes to his support in the MAGA movement. But today we get an interesting report from the New York Times, which I was kind of shocked to read. I had to check if it wasn't from the so-called Babylonian Bee, that the U.S. ambassador in Israel, Mike Huckabee, met privately at the U.S. Embassy with the former spy, Jonathan Pollard, who stole, the crown jewels and brought them to Israel in the 80s. So I want to ask you about how much of what is happening internally in the United States is influencing what Trump is doing on the international stage, especially as it relates to Israel, and more concretely when it comes to that new comprehensive security partnership with Saudi Arabia.
I think we need to keep in mind that right now the United States government is a wholly owned subsidiary of perhaps 7, 8, or 9 Zionist billionaires. These are the people that funded and ultimately installed President Trump in the White House. He is beholden to them. They control him. They shape policy. Nothing happens in the White House or on the Hill without their consent and without their knowledge. This means that when President Trump holds a meeting in the Oval Office, the people that are in there with him, advising him, are keeping these billionaires apprised of what's going on. Well, that effectively means that we are currently governed by foreign entities, that we Americans have lost control over our country. I think this has been true for some time. The difference is that there is a certain arrogance that springs from the confidence that the Zionists control everything, that they're willing to go public and essentially say whatever they like and then tell you when you object, what are you going to do about it? And I think that's where President Trump is right now. President Trump isn't terribly concerned about anything because the people backing him are going to stand by him. Now, could he become a liability at some point? I think that's true. That's the thing he has to be concerned about. He has an unrealistic picture of the United States as a country at this point. We are not the country of 1991. We do not maintain, nor do we have readily at hand the kind of overwhelming military power that we once did, especially in 1991. I don't think he's caught up with that. I think he is somewhat delusional insofar as he believes that no one can stand against us and we can dominate everyone. Remember, President Trump really does believe that bullying people works. There's a story that from many, many years ago. This is from the early 1990s, and it involved a negotiation between ourselves and the Russians. In fact, this may have actually been in the 80s before the Soviet Union collapsed. And someone who at the time was representing the President of the United States met with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, who then was a reality TV star and billionaire real estate investor, gave him advice. He said, the first thing you do is that you go in there, and he was telling the American team leader for the negotiations with the Soviets, you go in there, you put your finger in their chest, and you go right up to the man in charge and say, screw you. You're going to do what we want. We're going to get this, and you're going to go along with it. And that's the end of it. And he thought that this was a great way to open negotiations with the Soviets. Obviously, the man didn't take that advice, thank goodness, nor did anyone take that kind of advice in the 1990s after the Soviet state fell. But that is very much Donald Trump. For him, it's a tactic. It's the way to get things done. And I think he's doing that now with Venezuela. I think he's done that in the Middle East. That's what he's tried to do with the Russians. It's failed. It has no chance of success. First of all, no one is afraid of us in the sense that perhaps they were 30 or 40 years ago, because we are not that strong economically, nor are we that strong militarily. And I don't think he's put two and two together. So to understand what we are doing right now, you have to understand his mentality that says bullying as a tactic works. That's number one. Number two, we're the center of the world. Our market is more important than anybody else's. Well, that's just not true. When he left the ASEAN summit just a couple of weeks ago, everybody immediately gathered around the Chinese because everybody in Asia is interested in doing business with China. And threatening people who want to do business with China doesn't work because their market is de facto the largest in the world. They want access to it, and they don't fear the Chinese militarily. The Chinese don't present a military threat to anybody. They see the Chinese from a purely economic standpoint, and everybody is very, very wary of the presence of large numbers of Chinese in their countries. And the Vietnamese and Indonesians, everybody has gone through the process of throwing every Chinese in the country out at some point in their history. But that doesn't mean they don't want to do business. That's something that I don't think President Trump understands. And when you start threatening the people who are doing business with the Russians, like the Indians or the Japanese, he went to Japan, and the Japanese were very nice to him. They gave him a beautiful set of the most expensive golf clubs that probably have ever been made in the world. And then they gave all these things to him and said, we love you. We're so happy to have you here, and we want to do business with America. But by the way, President Trump, we're going to buy oil and gas from Russia. That's not negotiable. And I don't think he gets it. I think maybe he's beginning to, But I don't think he understands that no nation in the world can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests. That's true for Poland and Germany and Japan and Korea and everyone else. So when you start threatening people or trying to bully people if they don't align their policies with yours, you have to step back and say, no, wait a minute. These people aren't the enemies of the United States, but they have interests just as we have interests. And they're going to continue to do business in ways that serve their interests. Fighting with people over that, punishing people with sanctions over that is a dead end. But that's where we are right now. And I think this Epstein thing is the tip of a proverbial iceberg, because everybody in Washington that is anybody is probably on the list and has been engaging in all sorts of sexual depravity. Nobody should be surprised. Wherever you have great wealth, great power, inevitably you have an inexhaustible quantity of sin. And these people are now in a very difficult position because they've been in it with impunity. Now they're going outed. So you put all of this together, and what I see in the United States and its government right now is a government that is in chaos. There is no coherent national strategy. There's no coherent national military strategy. There's no coherent scientific industrial strategy. There is no high technology strategy. In other words, when you don't know where you're going, then almost any road will take you there to your destination. That's our problem right now. So people are saying, well, how could we lurch from a potential war between ourselves and Iran in the Middle East, our disagreements with the Russians in Ukraine, and then suddenly end up in the Southern Caribbean, ready to stage a coup and invade a country down there that apparently has lots of natural resources? Well, it's because there is no larger overarching strategy. Everything is about bullying and threatening. It's a dead end. It's not going to work.
Well, Colonel, one final question. Um, the man who sort of contributed to these economic woes of the United States is being buried today. The man who said deficits don't matter. I'm obviously talking about former Vice President Dick Cheney. I was wondering if you could offer some of your reflections or final thoughts on Cheney and his role in the current predicament that the United States finds itself in. You know, I'm a historian by trade. I've read a lot on the man. Some say great Secretary of Defense, but Vice President, well, I'll leave that for you to comment. I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on the late Vice President.
Well, I was in Paris in 1990, and this, I think, was early September or October, before we finally were given the alert to go to Saudi Arabia. And I went to a Council of Foreign Relations meeting when I was a term member, and he was the speaker. And so I had a chance to meet with him briefly, and I handed him a regimental coin and said, you know, if you're going to do this, don't forget us, the Second Cavalry. We don't want to be left out if you're going to do this in the Middle East. And I think he was, by the standards of American history, a competent Secretary of Defense. He acted at the time to cancel a number of programs that sadly were subsequently resuscitated, and we spent money on them, such as the V-22. But he had a grip on reality in terms of national defense. Now, he himself had never served, and that meant that he was always a little intimidated by general officers. And that's a big problem for us. There's nothing in the United States Constitution that says in order to be Secretary of Defense or President or anything else, you must have served in the U.S. military. But the problem is, since there's no such requirement, you get large numbers of people that end up in charge of the military without really knowing much about it, how it works. He was better than most, but he was by no means brilliant. When he comes back the second time, he is committed to this larger globalist neocon agenda, which essentially translated into making the Middle East safe for Israel. And so we go into Afghanistan very briefly. We lose interest in it. We turn our attention immediately to Iraq. And everyone knew when we went into Iraq in 2003 that you could go in there, you could, replace Saddam Hussein and his family with another group of generals. But whatever you did, you didn't want to stay in the country. You did not want to completely liquidate and dismantle the army because, frankly, most of the army wasn't going to fight you anyway. They certainly were going to lay down their lives for Saddam Hussein. And so we missed an opportunity. We could have left the administration in place. We could have left the military in place, replaced the people at the top, and then stood back and backed that new regime as required. We could have made the decision, okay, now we'll do business, we'll get along. But we were dealing with Cheney and Wolfowitz and Libby and Shulsky and a number of other people who were determined that they were going to transform Iraq into an Israeli-friendly country. And in fact, that was the comment that Paul Wolfowitz made to President Bush in 2003. A couple of months into this disaster in May, before we sent Paul Bremer over, Wolfowitz came across, spoke with Cheney. The two of them walked into the Oval Office and told President Bush something that was very important. In fact, it was Vice President Cheney who said, Paul's here, and I think you ought to listen to what he has to say and tell us what you think, boss, as they called him. And so Wolfowitz outlined this plan to completely transform Iraq from the bottom up. We're going to disband the military, disband the administration, disband everything. We're going to rebuild Iraq because it's so weak. And it's going to become the first Arab liberal democracy, and it's going to be friendly to Israel. And so President Bush, whose knowledge of everything was minuscule, particularly of foreign policy and certainly of the Middle East, said, okay, guys, let's do it. So the decision was taken to send over Paul Bremer, dismantle everything, and the rest is history. It was a catastrophe. And if you look at the Middle East today, yes, you can buy off the Peninsular Arabs. You can buy off the Emirates. These little statelets are entirely defenseless, and they will sacrifice whatever is required so long as they stay in power and they continue to enrich themselves. But when you get to Iraq, that's a different situation entirely. The Iraqis have made it very clear they want us out. And if anything, Iraq is a de facto ally of Iran. And of course, one of the arguments for going in there was to prevent that from happening, and that's exactly what did happen. The rest of the region is in turmoil, and Israel is more widely hated and despised now than ever in its history. So the things that Wolfowitz and friends wanted to achieve, what Cheney was part and parcel of, have failed. And we're in a very uneasy position right now. The war in the Middle East could recommence at any time. It's all a function of what Mr. Netanyahu wants to do. And right now, we are living in an environment, thanks to these billionaires, that means that our friend Mr. Netanyahu exerts far more influence and power over Congress than Donald Trump does. And Mr. Netanyahu is ultimately exerting far more influence and dominance over Trump than any foreign head of state should be allowed to exercise over a president of the United States. I don't think this is a secret. I think everybody knows it. Nobody quite knows what to do about it. But depending upon what happens next when we go into Venezuela, that could in fact be a game changer for Washington and for President Trump, because that could easily blow up into quite a disaster. Not the sort of disaster we anticipate in a war with Iran or Russia, but a disaster that starts off with a slow burn and then becomes an all-consuming Vietnam-like event. And that would destroy President Trump, his administration, just as surely as it destroyed LBJ and his administration.
Well, hopefully that doesn't happen by the time we have our next conversation, which I'm hoping we will, here on DR Global with you, Doug. Thank you once again for your insight, and hope to see you soon. And if we don't contact each other before then, from all of us here, wishing you an early, happy Thanksgiving next week.
Well, thanks very much. And God bless Poland. And I pray for Poland's leadership and for Poles to have the leadership they deserve.
Thank you, Doug. We'll be in contact. Take care.